you get your audio entertainment for the commute the next day or wherever you're headed. And those should be up to date now. We were pretty close. I think there's one missing that I kind of didn't have an archive for, so I'll figure that one out, but everything else is up there. Into 56th episode now, so we'll crack on with the topic for today is fast charger competition. Finally, behind me here, you'll see a thing that looks like a map of measles, bunch of different colors, bunch of different networks that represents. We're going to get into today, kind of stoked a little bit by Eric having some very good ideas, but also his video covering 1,000 miles or so of California over the last week or two, and a bunch of different options there. I think this is something that Eric has actually had for a while. Perhaps we'll be able to delve into this a little bit, how long California has had this kind of level of competition versus when Walter and I have seen it, but we really want to start digging into who these players are now, who they're going up against, and kind of what will set some out from others. We're starting to have a lot of choices here. The other thing that got me onto this was Tyler at the Average EV had a video out where they're basically in the same lot. You have Electrify America and Mercedes-Benz high power charging side by side, and he was finding a hard reason to go to Electrify America, pricing, power, number of stalls, quality of equipment, all of that stuff. The newcomers are just kind of outclassing the older guard. So this will follow on a little bit from what we've discussed last time out. But yeah, Eric, you kind of helped us prompt this. So maybe you want to lead into it and we can crack on from there.
Yeah, and I don't know. I noticed with Walter and me muted, there was a bit of a tapping coming from your audio.
Oh, okay. Let me figure that out whilst you guys go at it. And if anyone has any kind of things they're hearing out on that side, let me know in the comments.
Yeah, and I think, I guess just to start off, yeah, the question that I had that sort of brought it to my mind, right, is how are these networks going to start? These competitive networks, how are they going to start wooing customers who are maybe used to using the Superchargers, or I guess based also, yeah, like you said on Tyler's video, a lot of people seem still kind of captured by Electrify America. And that recent trip that I did, I was really surprised by how little what I would consider some very compelling public charging sites were, like how little they were being used. And I mean, this was on a Saturday, right? So it's not like I did one of my typical trips on a weekday when there's no traffic and I'm kind of avoiding that. This should have been an extremely high traffic time period. And what I saw from the public charging usage was just very, very minimal. And as I was actually heading to that Livingston TA Travel Plaza, so it's 6 400 kilowatt Alpitronic units, 12 stalls, completely empty the entire time I was there. Time of use pricing, 35 cents a kilowatt hour, which is good anywhere in the country, but for California, that's literally like half off.
Yeah.
And I was there alone the entire time. And I saw a couple of different Superchargers, both before and after it, and they were very busy, including a number of non-Tesla vehicles that I saw charging there. And for me, it just makes me question, like, what's the motivation? What's driving people to still avoid some of these newer providers when they're cheaper, when they're just as fast, when there's just as many stalls? We know the Alpitronic hardware is reliable. And, for me, I know that personally using an adapter kind of erases all of the benefits and sort of ease of use of using something like a Tesla network. And we still haven't seen a lot of the native NACS non-Tesla EVs coming out yet. So it kind of got me wondering what's it going to take for these other charging providers to actually woo people and get them to come over and use their network. So that's kind of what prompted me to ask the question.
Walter, how did, I mean, obviously you've seen Eric's video, you've kind of seen a lot of this developing in your area as well, with so many of the major players starting out down in the southeast there, and you've done the trip across the country as well. So what, as you kind of seen these stops, how often are you seeing kind of these new providers and the old ones pop up next to each other, very close to each other, and how does that competition kind of stack up from your tracking of those projects?
Well, specifically in the southeast, there's certain corridors, specifically Interstate 75, which is be increasingly common that there's exits that are getting favored for charging stops for multiple providers. Interstate 95 also has a couple of locations that used to be very difficult to traverse in a non-Tesla. My wife and I actually did that, having to basically use EVgo to get out of the state of Florida and then Electrify America with derated stations in South Carolina in order to get back home. And we used a dealer charger as a last resort in Columbia, South Carolina to get us the last stretch of the way home. But that's no longer the case. Like you say, there's multiple exits now where not only is there charging, there's charging options. Specifically, Brunswick, Georgia is one that is coming to mind, that has Travel Centers of America, that has IONNA, and a Pilot Flying J all on one exit. And that is in a, if anyone's ever done 95 into Florida, that stretch of 95 is pretty absent all forms of civilization, let alone charging. So having 3 to choose from before you make the final push into the state of Florida is definitely a luxury that didn't used to be there. And not only are there charging stations there, I mean, full service travel plazas and canopies and brand new state of the art chargers. And boy, what a change.
Yeah, I think we've called this out a few times as we've gone through the various projects. I think dating back to my trip in 2024 across to Washington State, that's where I first really started to notice it, especially getting back out of the kind of boonies of the Montana, Idaho kind of section where there's only a few options here or there. Electrify America is present. Pilot Flying J had started to make its presence known even then. But as we hit like kind of Spokane and also notably like Ellensburg, Washington, which isn't a huge town, but did have Pilot Flying J coming soon. There's a Rivian Adventure Network gone live there more recently. Superchargers were starting to open up. I think there may have been a Magic Dock there, or at least one that is accessible to NACS partners. And then they had the original kind of Electrify America 4-stall that we've come to know and love. But you start to see that 2 options, 3 options, 1 coming soon, 4 options, 5 options. And it gets into the place where, you hit that question that Tyler asked, which would you choose? And that's becoming more and more common. I know in Wisconsin, Jay at the Wisconsin channel was starting to look forward to like the kind of, I think it was the Janesville area or maybe the Lake Delton, Wisconsin Dells, because they had IONNA, Quick Trip, Tesla Superchargers, bunch of different options going in, and we're starting to find those. We all kind of expected the Superchargers to be the go-to and the main option, putting a new fast charging opportunity on the table for everybody, really. But that's opened up. But as it's opened up, probably a lot of the time, a Pilot Flying J, Mercedes-Benz high-power charging, maybe even an IONNA, which we'll get onto in a minute, they may have opened up before them. So we've got to get into it a little bit later on. What makes people choose the Supercharger network, perhaps? Kind of long-standing reliability, stall count, bunch of different things that we'll get into.
Price.
Pricing is a huge one. Amenities, maybe not for the Supercharger side, but I know Eric wanted to kind of touch on some of that. We haven't even touched on Walmart here, and I know stuff that I missed Landon's intro there, but he's sitting in a Walmart neighborhood market in Bentonville, Arkansas. We have progress only needing a transformer here. 2 of the 3 Beeville locations at this point. So Walmart is another one that it's not even, we don't talk about it, in a sense of being a competitor yet, maybe, or an option on these trips. But if you look at their coming soon map, it's only a matter of time, probably months now rather than years before they're in this mix as well. So I want to kind of jump back a little bit just to kind of acknowledge IONNA as well, because we had a question there. What's to do with the slowdown? I think it was just kind of Walter answered that actually in the comments, but Paul was asking what happened to IONNA when they stalled. But this week they've just passed the 100, right? I think we're actually probably over 100 now.
Yeah.
Convenient timing, and I think probably intentional now that it was announced on the same day as the EV Charging Summit started up in Las Vegas. My sense on that, as we asked a few times, why did they do that big push towards the end of 2025 and then just kind of let it stall out for basically 2 or 3 months? My sense is that they probably ran up against the 2-year anniversary, wanted to do their celebrations for that, and then had kind of a press calendar that wanted a nice press release for the start of March, middle of March. So maybe the marketer in me, but I have suspicions there. But they're past it now, got that monkey off their back, and probably kicking into next wave of openings, right? Eric, you have kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think, Walter, I might have made a comment on one of your videos about this, because I think Walter did a video where you were talking about how you were a little bit concerned because it was both Pilot Flying J, and maybe there are two different videos, but both Pilot Flying J and IONNA seem to be plateauing a bit. And my assumption right now is we see how many of those pending sites that they have in California. And I think they're running up against the California red tape wall. And so what you're going to end up with is delays. And then probably my guess is 4 to 6 months from now, we're going to see both Pilot Flying J and IONNA dump another 100, 150, 200 sites between the two of them. And it's mostly going to be in California with sites that are maybe already physically complete and just haven't been or can't be powered up yet. So, yeah.
In early on in the Pilot Flying J project, when I was covering it, you chimed in at one point saying that, well, they probably are just doing all their locations, and California will likely be kind of like laggards just because of the red tape. And now this is what we're seeing. I mean, look at the Pilot Flying J's that are popping like tulips in the springtime over in California now, and it just took a while to come to fruition, but it's happening. So similarly, like you say, IONNA might very well be up against the brick wall that is the California red tape that will eventually work its way through, and you'll have a whole bunch of stations opening right around the same time in their network as well.
Yeah, and I mean, how long ago was it that I found that sleeper site in Ripon, California for EVgo, the Pilot Flying J? And it's been a month or two.
It seemed like every week you were coming up with a new station that was opening.
Right, but the thing is that Pilot Flying J in Ripon was powered on when I was there. It had the transformers, the screens were lit up. It still has not been open. So how is it a station that's been physically complete, power on, and the stations are even lit up, and it hasn't been opened yet, and that was nearly 2 months ago now.
Yeah, and it's not even a business license because it's had an established business. It's just an ancillary service.
And there are examples of that, from across the country, really. I mean, some of this may be the red tape side as well, because we have the one down in Dublin at the racetrack in Georgia. That's their first site. I've been watching that one for about 3 months now. It's been in the ground. It's actually lit up. It's in the Charge Lab app, but it just hasn't, got the green light from somebody. It's probably more a state agency thing at that point, because there are obviously certain ribbon cutting events that want to be happening with some of the first Nevi sites, but once they get going, they really do start to race away. Pennsylvania, a good case in point, this week adding another, I think it was 12 sites to its travel corridors for Nevi, and they're at 31 right now, and another 90 or so in the bag. So there's a bunch there still coming, and that's obviously going to fuel some of these secondary networks. Francis, Electric Era has a lot of stations across the country. I think they're about to, if they haven't already opened it, they've got one way up here in this corner, far up there. My finger disappears, but up in Orono, Maine, that's opening up pretty soon. So you get a lot of providers. We'll talk a lot about the competition from the big players, but Eric, you had mentioned Electric Era, and they were, I think, one of the last sites on your 1,000-mile trip. Even those players who I wouldn't necessarily call regional anymore because they've gone from Washington to Maine and could probably pretty soon cross the country with them, but they don't have a huge site footprint, but they are in the mix when you start to look at where you might stop to charge on a long journey.
Yeah, and I would say electric era in specifically, if I had to call out a single non-Tesla provider that provided the best analog to a supercharger site, like a V3 supercharger site, it would be electric era. Just between their reliability, they're all mostly 8 stalls or so. A lot of them are the split power 200 kilowatt, but the Nevi sites, they're upping the power, but they're almost always immediately off the freeway. They're right next to usually like a gas station or a convenience store, super convenient, super reliable, a bunch of different stalls. And they're really designed, I would say, for those sort of smaller, more efficient cars that are just ripping it down the freeway, trying to go as quickly as they can, get in, get out in 10 to 15 minutes and be back on the road again. And so for them to be as underutilized as they are, at least from my experience, I realize that this is anecdotal, but to me, given the quality of what they provide, they seem really underutilized. And like I said, I've seen so many EVs that I know were looking to charge, drive right past it as though they didn't even know the site was there. And they very likely didn't, right? Because maybe if they did look in PlugShare, maybe they had their filters set and they don't even know that Electric Era is a network that they should be looking for, or in-car route planning or navigation just completely overlooks them. I know I've heard this from Rivian owners, and I've seen this too, where Rivian's route planning omits a lot of chargers and omits a lot of networks. So yeah, it just seems to me that like certain providers like that, when you're providing such a high quality service, that's so analogous to another service that's being very highly used, it makes me wonder what is that difference between those two, because of just how similar of an offering they are, but the distinct difference in usage.
I mean, it brings us on to when you set out to do a road trip or even a regional trip, what you're using, how you're making that plan. Obviously, the early days of EV route planning were pretty much, if you weren't in a Tesla, you were getting out PlugShare, you were sitting on a desktop and probably doing a few hours research because you needed to do the whole pilot thing of calculate, not pilot flying J, actual pilot, system checks, make sure that you had the range, make sure that the wind wasn't blowing in the wrong direction, make sure you had the ability to charge up in a particular place and get down the mountain or up the mountain. Actual things that I've done. But at the moment, it's clearly this competition means that these sites, it's not just the fact that they're right next to each other or that they're maybe within 10 miles of each other. It's that they're everywhere, more or less. I mean, there's definitely some gaps above my head, and we shouldn't ignore the fact that there are some parts of the country that are still going to have the kind of limited, I've got 200 miles between chargers and really need to think about how it works. But those are very few and far between at this point, especially with access to the Tesla Supercharger network for the 65-70% of it that we now have access to as NACS partners. But the piece of that outside of route planning is, assuming it was a carte blanche and everybody knew where everything was, we have to get into what are they looking for? How do you make that decision when they're in that kind of Tyler at the average EV scenario? They're right next to each other. At this point, it's not a case of I don't know they're there, because you can't miss them unless you're, literally on another part of the side of the parking lot. Walter, if you were kind of pulling in all things being equal to exactly the same area, just because this was the place you wanted to charge, it has exactly the same amenities, exactly the same places to park and charge. What are you looking for as you get into that lot? And if you can put yourself in the position of someone who doesn't know a whole lot about charging, what might you kind of look to guide your decision on where to charge?
So I'm chronically lethargic. So closest to the amenity of which I want to use, which is likely a restroom, is very likely going to be the place that I pick. That price is probably going to be a second in line. But before we get a little bit too far down, you guys kind of both mentioned the in-dash nav. I just want to see if I'm alone here. Do either of you all get in your EVs and plug in your final destination and just let the route planner choose your charging stops? I don't. I mean, I'm thinking I might be unique, but I'm venturing a guess I'm not.
I don't, but my wife does.
Does
I'm
she?
quite often
Okay.
going at this point and ignoring my own request to you there. I'm looking at specifically at PlugShare for the places I haven't charged. I'm trying to tick new places off the box.
Yeah, it's a game. It's like what's out there, what's fun, what's I want to see something, and so I pre-picked my stops, and so for me, it's something that is a hobby, I guess is a good way of describing it. And if I have an opportunity, like this past weekend, I did a vicarious road trip through watching Eric's YouTube video. It was great fun. We got to see all kinds of new goodies out there, and up to the Tehachapi's, I believe is the correct pronunciation, and back again, there and back again. It was a terrific video and a lot of cool charging stops that he brought us to, and that to me is really what I'm doing when I go on a road trip. I basically have my stops pre-selected, and just am driving from. So I'll use the in-dash navigation to get me to the next stop, but I'm not letting the in-dash navigation pick my stops for me, a la Tesla. And even when I had a Tesla, it really wasn't that good, because you could be going down the middle of Mississippi, back end interstate, whatever it's called, and all of a sudden the wind will start shifting or the temperature will drop, and all of a sudden Tesla will say, okay, so turn around, go 180 degrees in the opposite direction, go back to the Tesla Supercharger that you just passed. And you're like, no, I can make it to the next one, sort of thing. And so even in a Tesla, I would pre-pick my charging stops. So I don't know who these people are who do that, but maybe I'm just naive of the amount of influence those in-dash navigation systems have on driving traffic to certain locations. And I know with Teslas, it's a little bit more notorious for being able to suck cars into charging stations. They open a new supercharger and all of a sudden, boom, there's all the Teslas that show up like they've been just waiting for it to pounce on, and definitely see that. So that can't be argued with.
I have a question. What's a route planner? I'm just kidding. Sorry.
What's the best route planner?
Yeah. So no, I mean, I kind of got used to never having route planner, and I don't know, Steve, maybe that's something that you and I both kind of experienced early on, but it still holds true to this day, where the trips are almost more. I'm not planning my trip about, like, when I'm going to share a trip like that 1,000-mile trip that I did, I put in a bunch of waypoints along the way for locations I wanted to make sure that I checked, right? So even that second Electrify America site that I used in Lost Hills in California, I would never use that site normally. Like that's not first of all, I don't necessarily use Electrify America anymore just because I don't have their app. The charge point CPEs 250s along that route are just as fast for my Bolt EV, and they're actually cheaper when you don't have an account, right, or a membership. So literally the only reason I used that Electrify America was because it's co-located right next to a pilot where I'm expecting GM Energy to be putting a site in at some point in the near future. So that's like literally the only reason I used it. And so I'll put those types of sites in my map.
And I couldn't tell, was that one on the property of Pilot?
No, it's on it's a different market. They're like right next to each other though. So yeah, you might as well be right. I literally walked into Pilot and got some coffee. But but yeah, it's so those types of sites that's how I manage my trips, because it's less about planning for my EV and like what Steve was describing about back in the day. There were a lot of trips that you would make where you had no choice. this was the charging location that you had to use, and you had to charge up this amount, usually some amount past 80 to 90%, in order to make it to the only charging station after that. So those days are long gone for most of the country. So at this point, my route planning is really just what is cool along this route that I want to check out and share. And that's kind of how I plan my trips. But at this point, normally I'll put in my final destination in Google Maps. If I'm just driving for me, I'll put in my destination in Google Maps. And as I'm driving and as I feel the need to stop, or I see that my car will eventually need to be charged along the route, that's when I'll interact with Google and ask upcoming charging stations and then just make a decision from there. I don't really plan out my trips anymore.
I have to bring people into the pain of Hyundai Kia ownership here, I guess. Although when it gets there and charges, it charges fast. But with an EV6 or an Ioniq 5 or any of these vehicles, the in-car navigation will more or less do some very strange things. It's actually got better over time, but yeah, there's some weird things in it. And if you're in winter and you want to charge it up, the chances are the latest charging station you want to visit isn't in your map navigation system, so you have to navigate to one of the older ones just to find it, and then you're battling the dual internal navigation and Google Maps to follow the Google Maps one, but make sure you keep the other one on for your preheating. So that's the fun and quality of Hyundai.
And then you get yelled at when you pass the dummy charging station.
There's a lot of bong 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 going on as it tells you you've gone the wrong way. Trust me, I know this. Brian is one. We've actually got a lot here. Just quickly on Craig's point. Let's face it, if we're tuning in live, we are EV geeks. Yes, we sign off every episode with cheers nerds. So that is, we resemble that remark. And route planning ourselves is exactly what we want to do. So that makes perfect sense, of course. But Brian, the Tesla Model Y is doing most of the work for him and Joan as he takes these epic trips across the Midwest and other parts of the country from there. So he's almost always just let the car sort it out unless there's a specific spot he wants to hit. Easier when traveling with kids, even when it's not always best. Exactly. If you have a family on board, I mean, I still do it myself, but I think that's speaks more to the need to overcome the car's limitations, because it's not telling me what kind of amenities are at this next charging stop. So if I'm with a kid who needs to run around in some green space, it's up to me to figure that out rather than the car. I'm not sure Tesla would do that for you either, but you probably know, and Brian's done so many trips now, he probably knows which Supercharger has a big space for him to run around in and which has the right amenities attached. But I think, yeah, it's a solid point that, we should also put ourselves in the position of the folks who are jumping into new EVs like an Equinox EV or an Ioniq 5, in the current model year, and what do they have in front of them? Will they just plug in the destination and go? And what would the experience be like? It's in an Ioniq 5 or a Hyundai Kia EV. I don't think it's going to be great for them. They probably would. I'd have to do some more testing, but I would bet they would get dropped in an Electrify America, or it doesn't seem particularly judicious in figuring out, you can tell it to filter out certain networks, you can tell it to only do certain power levels. But I don't know, Walter, is it any better in that kind of native Android automotive system that you would have in the Equinox EV or the Cadillac Lyriq, if you were to choose that way of doing it?
I never have done it. I've never, ever let my car done.
We've got a test for you to do now.
I mean, one thing I can say about the Android Automotive in-dash navigation is its ability to GOM accurately is very good. And so that is one thing that I've noticed, and it's not unique to brand. It's the same thing in the GM cars that I've owned and the Volvo, which both used Android Automotive as in-dash navigation. I would call it even better than Tesla. And I think the folks who do the analytics at Google did a wonderful job of building that system. And I think they're not doing it out of, a noble cause in order to give back to the community. I think eventually there's going to be a very strong business case for metadata harvesting or something. They're also able to show that when a car plugs into a charging station, whether or not it was successful on the first plug or not, they can get all kinds of telemetry from that and then put that back into the ranking of a station's reliability or all kinds of other things that may be on their roadmap for global domination, as every good multinational conglomerate tries to do. But as far as picking the stations, I do know that my wife, similar to, I guess, what your wife does, Steve, does rely on it. And she ended up at a really nice station on the way back from going up to the mountains on Monday of this week. It's a Kaloum fast charger with a solar canopy that uses an EV Connect for the payment system. And she was just really delighted. It was in the north end of uptown Charlotte in kind of a trendy spot. And so for her, it seems to work out well, but she does have the stations that she prefers. We don't really do many long distance road trips. So basically everywhere we're going, we know where we're going to be charging, because it's been a rinse and repeat now for a couple of years at the charging stations that we go to. But they're popping up all over the place. So I almost wonder if Google in-dash navigation has a hard time getting the new stations added. And there's some question I have for how those stations actually get added into Android Automotive Google Maps, because in my day job, we opened a new venue and we had to go through the whole process of trying to list a business onto Google Maps. And it's not as intuitive as you might think. It's not crowdsourced like PlugShare. It's got to be legit. So I'm not exactly sure how those stations get listed and the analytics sent northbound into the Google API in order to be ingested. But somewhere that has to take place. So maybe that might be a determining factor. But I would say minus Tesla, the Android Automotive probably has the largest horde of cars behind it that if you list a station could potentially pull them towards you. And I think IONNA has figured out how to skin that. Maybe I shouldn't say skin that cat. IONNA has figured out how to do that. And so that might be something on the future that we might see.
And I think, we've obviously kind of touched on route planners, Tesla being the kind of primary, they're going to route to superchargers by default in most cases. I think we're starting to see a little bit of third-party intrusion into that, especially with, probably this time last year that they had the preheating and conditioning the pack, for the third-party charging locations. But I think it's still very much a case of what if you're in a Tesla, you're probably 90% of the time going to go to a Tesla supercharger again, unless you're in the nerd category of wanting to check something out. But it does start to get into the overlap now that we've got with the fascinating piece of Supercharger for Business. So starting to go to, well, you are now in the Tesla supercharger navigation, but you're actually going to a Francis site or an independent business site or any number of these businesses that are starting to come out. And it sounds from Leonard's initial reports that we got a couple of weeks ago like that is making a significant difference to utilization. I mean, of course, they're going to say that this is, at a ribbon cutting, they're going to try and celebrate the move that they're making. But I wouldn't be surprised at all to learn that, people who are just suddenly being routed there, you can make a decision if you're Tesla, tweak the algorithm, maybe lean on the scales a little bit to send them towards these places to show, look, Supercharger for Business works. Supercharger for Business is a good investment for these, whether you're a small entrepreneur or, an existing network who needs to kind of turn things around. It wouldn't be a surprise to know that, they're being routed to these locations. And that's where you get the overlap with, okay, you're a non-Tesla network, but you have superchargers and can access that.
Well, it wasn't so long ago that if you had a Tesla, you had basically to go to a Tesla supercharger in order to recharge. It was so there wasn't enough. Now that we're J3400 standardized in the North American market, you would think that eventually that siloing is going to erode at one form or another. Either Tesla is going to integrate a broader selection, or the crowds is, the owners are just going to start using something else for navigation. And I know that sounds unthinkable, but I think that very well might start happening. If you have a 500 kilowatt charger over here with a J3400 handle that costs less than the Tesla Supercharger over there, and I know that's kind of a unique situation, but let's just say that's the case, I would be kind of upset as a Tesla owner that Tesla didn't tell me to go to this one over here that's faster and cheaper, and might have more amenities. So eventually, I think one of those two things is going to happen. Either Tesla is going to start showing a wider breadth of selections, or the owners are going to come up with a solution to navigate using other means. So it's no longer the case that Teslas have to charge at Tesla Superchargers, but that did used to be the case.
Yeah, and I think there's also kind of an element of monetization to this, right? Because I've never personally used route planners, and I've experimented with them, and one of the things that I was always told is some of my not so great experiences with a better route planner were the result of not using the paid version, right? The professional version or whatever. And so I see that part of this is, and we kind of saw this with the Supercharger network in general, where if it's being baked into Tesla's overall operating costs, right? It's now, for them, it's a cost center, but it's a marketing tool. It's a way for them to gain business. And so they can provide a better service either for a lower cost or basically at cost to them. And it's still a net benefit for their business. And that route planner kind of fits into that model the same way, where to have a superior route planning model to what's built into a Tesla, you're likely going to have to pay for it, which is probably not something that someone is going to want to do. But then in this, it all creates sort of this, I guess, an ecosystem, right, is what would best be used to describe it, where Tesla is not incentivized to direct anyone outside of their network. They're able to offer a superior route planner at cost because it's part of their business model. And so it kind of creates this feedback loop that you're always going to direct. And that's where I think, you brought up the point about Francis, Steve, and I think that's an important thing, where we see these third parties now benefiting from being folded into that ecosystem. And it makes me want, and that's why the question always comes up to my mind is it a matter of brand loyalty? Is it simply a matter of ease? Is it a matter of compatibility or whatnot? And one thing, I think it was Leonard that had also mentioned it too, talking about how Tesla owners aren't going to necessarily want to use anything else because the price is always going to be lower within the Supercharger network. And that's, for me, there's two aspects of that. Is one, it is for Tesla owners, I understand, because they are getting a discounted rate. The question that kept coming up to me was, what would compel a non-Tesla owner to prioritize the Superchargers over non-Superchargers? But even still, in Northern California, at least in my experience, Tesla Superchargers are not the cheapest option, even for Tesla owners, right? So I've looked at the prices, and because you get those similar prices if you buy the monthly membership for Tesla, and I've looked at the prices and they're competitive once you pay for that membership or if you're a native Tesla owner, but they aren't cheaper. And like I said, that and we're seeing the biggest difference, I think, in time of use, where some of these networks are really leveraging time of use in areas where maybe the Superchargers aren't. And when you're presented with the option of paying 10 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour less than the Tesla Supercharger, and you're still prioritizing the Tesla Supercharger, that kind of makes me wonder, at that point, it's clearly not just a price difference that's guiding your decision making. So
Yeah, and if I could just kind of throw out here as a case study, and Steve, I don't know if you're able to pull up a web browser, but the PlugShare exit in Hillsboro, Texas, has 3 different stations that are all newly opened right on the exit. So they're all sitting right on the exit. One is a new V3.5 Tesla Supercharger station. One is a Mercedes-Benz high-powered charging. And the third is a BP Pulse at a Travel Centers of America. And of those 3, it's, we could argue pros and cons and price and everything. I really liked your video, Eric, where you showed the time of use at the BP Pulse being in the high 30s for the state of California. I mean, if I was a Tesla owner and my car was directing me a mile down the street in order to go to a Tesla Supercharger, even if I was getting, I don't know, 28 cents per kilowatt hour or something like that, maybe 32 cents per kilowatt hour, super low rate at an off hour. Yes, sir. Just a little bit north, there's a cluster of 3 pips. Yeah, those 3 pips right there. It's a really good case study. I'd be a little upset that my car didn't let me know that the BP Pulse had Alpitronic hyperchargers at 38 cents, and I just drove a mile down the road in order to use your network's chargers, and I could have been already, another 3 miles down the road because I didn't have to make this additional dog leg. But in this particular case, we have a full travel center. We have a Tesla Supercharger with a little bit more stark selection of amenities. And then we have a Mercedes-Benz high-powered charging with a really slick user interface at a little bit of a higher price. And of those 3, I think my personal opinion, if I was driving down the road in the cars that I own, I would go to the BP Pulse, just because for me, convenience and amenities are the primary determining factors for picking a charging station when I'm on a road trip. I want to go to the restroom. I want to fill up my cup. I want to maybe grab a snack and have a reliable charge. And all those are available at the BP Pulse. Although their interface might not be as slick, it has all the creature comforts that I would expect. And I would probably not go to the Mercedes-Benz just because it's not sitting right at a travel center. That property being built specifically for people doing interstate travels has definitely got all kinds of intrinsic benefits besides just the cost of the kilowatt hour. So the reliability of the hardware, as long as there's enough stations there and they're operational, my personal opinion is that's what I would select. But it's interesting. Like Tesla drivers would likely end up at the Tesla Supercharger station, even though there's fewer amenities there. Right across the street is the BP Pulse with more amenities, and they have J3400 handles, but the Tesla cars would drive them to the Tesla Supercharger station. And then the Mercedes-Benz, I'm not quite sure who would be pulled over there, but perhaps people who have a certain affinity for Mercedes-Benz.
Those beautiful, shiny gold and silver chargers.
Right?
Then you've got all of these, I assume, on Walmart at that point.
Well, and it's interesting because while this is still in my thoughts, I wanted to bring it up because I think, Walter, you and I have said the same thing too, where I think consistently across the country, especially if you break it out as a separate network, Pilot Flying J consistently has the best amenities, the best location, just overall in terms of travel, like amenities, access to freeway. Like I know there are some really bad Pilot Flying J sites, but overall as a network, right? Trash cans, squeegees, clean bathrooms, 24/7 access.
24/7 is a big one.
Yeah, well lit, canopies, pull through parking, right? Like not all of those are consistent, but they're fairly consistent across the network. I don't think any network comes even close. IONNA looks like they're trying to get there, but even then they're missing a lot of those key components. And based on the locations that they're choosing, they're never going to have it as consistently as Pilot Flying J is.
And they need a travel partner.
Right.
Someone who will park them right on the interstate exit.
Exactly. And so when you look at that and you say, well, then it should be a slam dunk, right? Pilot Flying J should be the number one choice. Everybody should be clamoring for them. There are still a couple of issues with them, and those actually align, because I've asked a lot of people, both Tesla owners and non-Tesla owners, why they prioritize the Superchargers. And I kind of wrote down some notes about like the top reasons that I've heard. One of the biggest ones is the number of stalls, the reliability, the pricing, and then the proximity to the freeway. Those are kind of the top reasons I've always heard from people who say that's why they're prioritizing the Superchargers. Now, with the number of stalls, that I think is a massive criticism for Pilot Flying J specifically. Their average stall count is barely over 4 stalls per site, whereas we're seeing IONNA, BP Pulse, Mercedes-Benz, they're averaging 7, 8, 9, 10 or more charging stalls per site on average, right? So having 4 stalls per site puts you well below that curve, and I could see why the rest of the amenities might not make up for that. Proximity to the freeway, though, I think is one of those things that maybe that isn't really what's going on. And then, of course, pricing. I paid 70 cents a kilowatt hour at one of the Pilot Flying J's that I used on that trip. That, like, to say that that was painful, I can't imagine doing that in a car that's getting worse than 3.5 miles per kilowatt hour in efficiency. And then, of course, reliability. That's the one that I think is maybe the most subjective, right? Because for me personally, and I mentioned it again in my video, I am still 100% first time activation success on Pilot Flying J. And that's after using them dozens and dozens of times. I have never once had to restart a session on a Pilot Flying J station. Auto charge worked automatically, started, never had it fail every time. So for me, like, you can't improve on that in terms of reliability, but I still hear people have issues with reliability. But I wonder how much of that has gotten to be subjective now. Where a lot of people, I think, Electrify America checks off a lot of the boxes that we talked about stall counts, about location, right? The one thing that they had, the fly in their ointment has always been their reliability, which has objectively improved over time. But it's almost as though maybe did that ship sail, right? Is that why people are now moving away from them? So I think it's worth considering, like, all of those different factors, because what I'm seeing, like I said, especially from some of these bigger charging networks now, with the exception of some key amenities like 24/7 bathrooms, canopies, squeegees, trash cans, and even then that's somewhat consistent. They're checking off every other box, whether it's reliability, whether it's the number of stall counts. So really, I'm seeing it with some of these big networks as all of those other reasons for not using them or prioritizing them have all just been kind of swept aside. So at least that's what I'm observing.
I mean, I'm willing to put reliability as the price of entry at this point. I know there's still a whole lot of conversation around it, but it really has kind of filtered away to the background of the excitement of how fast people are building, how big they're building, and what power levels they have. And I think, to me, it's going to a point where if you're not reliable, if there's, I know the reviews aren't as big a part for a lot of mainstream drivers, but you're going to fade into the background. You just won't be on the map in the first place. You won't be considered. It's like that, when you consider a hotel, you'll probably set it at least 4 stars or something, or, because the dirty ones and maybe the really cheapest ones you'll consider. But again, it's, there's a level of quality that everybody has. And I think the ones that are just failing miserably time after time are going to be, binned off in the early filters. I just don't think, and that's a facet of competition, right? Because you have these choices, you don't have to go to Electrify America anymore if it's absolutely out of order every 3 days and there's no way to tell rhyme or reason, whether it's going to be online when you get there, you're not going to go to that station, And Electrify America has improved across the board, but there are still a good 20-30% of the sites that haven't been upgraded yet, middle of the country in places where you really do need them, that you may be able to now discount those because a Pilot Flying J has gone in or a Tesla Supercharger is now accessible to you. And I think the reliability piece for me, for that reason, in most of the country and most of parts of Canada you're going to be traveling, kind of drops off the map. Pricing is an interesting one for me because I think Mark Barringer had summed up one point of it here. He charges at home, so the cost of a DC fast charging isn't a big deal because he wants to, get the reliability and amenities and convenience of the stops that he's going to choose. So that makes sense to me, but I do think kind of Leonard's counterpoint, the amenities will take the lion's share, but there's a point, right? There's a point where you look at it and you get kind of sticker shock and you maybe decide that that's not the place you're going to go.
Well, and you don't need the amenities at every stop too. That's the other factor.
Yeah, the example here, Francis is asking 78 cents per kilowatt hour in New Mexico, but the charge points he'll use there range from 39 cents to 55 cents per kilowatt hour. I think, there is a sweet spot there. I think once you get into, at least for me, in the Northeast is one of the more expensive parts, along with California, for fast charging. The 50s are fine. That's kind of average now. If it's below that, I'm pretty happy, and I think I'm getting something of a deal. Into the 60s, I start to question it. Into the 70s, it's clearly expensive, and anything above that, there are some egregious, 80 cents, $1. I've seen a few times. Those really get into the stupid, and you're using that as a video for kind of rage bait. But there is a point where you would say that's kind of really bleeding me dry, and that there would need to be a reason for using that. Again, it would have to be in the middle of North Dakota and you can't get anywhere without using it, or it's convenient and you stop for 5 minutes just to get enough to move on. But I think the price thing is interesting because there does seem to be a little bit of debate as to whether Tesla certainly says it's the cheapest in Tesla ownership, and then for people who are members, because they know Tesla is everywhere and Superchargers are always going to be there, they'll pay that membership and then not really think about it every month. $12.99 just kind of goes, and the rate is the member rate for them as well. So that makes sense to me that you would kind of gravitate towards Tesla at that point because you're on the membership. It's going to be there. It's going to have enough stalls for you. And, usually it's going to be the basic amenities at the very least. But I think, you're starting to get some price competition with the likes of IONNA, who quietly never really announced this. They certainly announced the GM discount for 10%. That's the first dealership OEM kind of, discount that is specific to a certain brand. So that's an interesting one that's just going to start touch the iceberg, scratch the surface of that. But they're also down to 20 cents per kilowatt hour for the opening week of a station, which kind of gives a little bit of the answer of, do they even know it's there? Well, maybe that's something that they can start to use to draw people in. But the thing that never really got announced was that they capped all the prices at 39 cents per kilowatt hour network wide at the moment. So with this 100+ network site count, I think is over like 31 states and getting more and more every month, that that you're not going to pay more than 40 cents at that location, and that is reasonable. Now, there's only, I think it's supposed to be 2026. There's only so long that's going to last, so this may change again in a little while. But 39 cents per kilowatt hour in a lot of cases is at least going to be on parity with Superchargers, and you start to get into the once you're there within a nickel maybe of what the price is, people may just say, well, it's just easier to use the network that I know across the board is cheaper than 39 cents, because there are places where Tesla Superchargers are 45, 50, going up to 60 in your area, Eric. So I don't know, that's the pricing thing is an ever moving target, because we never can really say any one network is for every Pilot Flying J that's got a 60 or 70 cents per kilowatt hour price tag. There are ones that are 45 in really good areas. But I don't know, Walter, what are you kind of feeling on the price versus amenities argument, and do you lean towards if you have to pick one or the other?
I think the landscape 3 years from now will have certain networks affinities to certain brands. For instance, Tesla Supercharger will, by nature and force of gravity, have Teslas in preponderance charging at them. And other brands will have their own networks where their member brands are charging at them. As you mentioned, the 10% discount for IONNA, if you're a GM owner, is kind of leaning towards that. In my particular case, I'm definitely becoming very IONNA centric with my selection when I'm doing road trips, just because they're very reliable stations. They're nice stations, nice looking. They have very basic amenities, and they're generally well placed with partner amenities close by if they don't have full rechargeries right on property as well. So for me, that's kind of a no-brainer. And so I think 3 years from now, we are going to have certain cars with certain badges charging at certain locations more so than others. And obviously GM at Pilot Flying J, they're going to work something out in order to draw GM vehicles to those pilot locations. I'm not sure what the answer is going to be. I was just asked again, someone who had a Lyric just prior to coming on the live stream, someone who has Lyric, they met the day of doom where their 2 years of free charging at EVgo ended, and all of a sudden they're like, wait, I have to pay for these charging sessions at the Pilot Flying J now. So I think that we'll have certain brand affinity with certain CPOs come 3 years from now. I think right now we're kind of in a transitional phase. However, I do think that there will be a moving target with price. My personal opinion is price is not a overly determining factor. If I'm tired and I'm trying to get home, my determining factor is speed. I'm tired. I want to get into my bed as soon as possible. I'll be happy for someone to take my money if I can charge my car faster or not have to drive as far to the station. It's no problem. I'll take another $5 out of my wallet in order to get me home a little bit faster. If I'm on a 3-day road trip that's solo and I'm doing camping and I've got all the time in the world and I don't mind hunting and pecking for the least expensive charger out there, that might be a fun little adventure in order to take. But if I don't have the luxury of time, that's where price becomes less of a determining factor. And I'm going to say it, for me, the Tesla Superchargers in the Charlotte metropolitan area tend to be pretty well bogged down. And the whole fact that with a General Motors car, I need to take 2 spaces is a awkward situation that I would avoid if possible. And price for me in that particular case is not that important. So I don't know. For me, I've kind of pruned Tesla Superchargers out of my vocabulary just because the shorter cables, I really have to nose my wife's Lyric right up to the stall if I'm on a V3 dispenser in order to get that thing to work. And burning 2 stalls in order to refuel in a congested location. Similarly, if there's a Tesla Supercharger that has a queuing line because it's a busy afternoon and it's a popular station, I don't care what the price is, I'm going somewhere else. So price for me is a moving target, as you said. It really depends on the situation. Am I free and liberal with my time, or am I on a time budget? And in which case I'm trying to get from point A to point B as fast as possible, at which point, just take my money. If I have to spend another $5 on this charge versus what I would have spent somewhere else, so be it. I just won't have a candy bar or something, or I will have a candy bar and then I'll just spend the extra $5.
Yeah. And, the thing that comes to my mind with this is it's like the old expression of stepping over dollars to pick up dimes. Like we really are quibbling over like pennies difference. And I mean, and this is coming from me, who is trying to be extremely frugal, right? And, I'm driving an EV that is in the upper echelon of the most efficient cars, EVs that are available. And it gets to the point of like, it's penny pinching, right? And so, I mean, there are some cases where it's just so egregious. And I think, Steve, you mentioned that if you're talking about like in California, I have a slightly different bar because of how expensive everything is across the board. But even for me, once you start breaching that 65 to 70 cents per kilowatt hour range, it really becomes very untenable, like in terms of price. And there are just so many other options just generally that you don't have to put up with that price. But like to Walter's point, for me, I'm always, it's amenities and how does it fold into my trip and what is it that I need to be doing at that time? Because if my whole point is I need to use the bathroom, well, it doesn't matter if it's 10 cents a kilowatt hour at a charger that doesn't have an on-site bathroom, because it just does not serve the purpose of my for my trip. So yeah, I think for me, I try not to quibble over it too much, just because I know that in the greater scheme of things, you're really talking about a difference of a few cents here or there. And and I'm not going to pick on Red E too much, but I had just done the math, right? Like in my Bolt EV, when I'm typically stopped, it's going to be somewhere between 25 and 30 kilowatt hours that I'm adding per stop usually. And the Red E that I stopped at had a $2 session fee in addition to being 60 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's already not cheap per kilowatt hour, but then you add that $2 session fee, and I was doing the math in my head, and it's like, now I'm getting close to 70 cents per kilowatt hour, even though and I'm looking at this site, and sure, it's right off the freeway. Sure, there's a convenience store nearby. Sure, it fits all of these other travel needs. And it's like, yeah, but I go 20 miles down the road and I'm literally paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour less. So let's just do that. Right. So,
and it's worth, stepping back and saying not every fast charge use is a road trip, right? There's a portion that are people who can't charge at home, rideshare drivers, where it becomes, potentially the difference between profit and break even, because every mile is part of your business. And you're doing it regularly, right? This may be the fast charge that you need between sessions and pickups. So if you can get something that is an IONNA at just below 40 cents versus a Pilot Flying J, which may be convenient but is at 60, 65 cents, then that makes a big difference to your overall take home. What else do we need to hit on pricing?
One final thought before we deviate from pricing. Is anyone on this call overly concerned about what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz? I said it.
Well, it changes the calculus, right? I mean, and this is, it's like the old people who drive across town to go to Costco to wait in a line to, suddenly all of your moaning about, how long it takes to charge is completely irrelevant, and how much it costs to charge, because you're doing exactly the same for gasoline. But, this immediately flips it on its head. It's very, very quick how different it makes, especially with so many used EVs coming.
And it made me remember when I used to drive a nice car, the fluctuation in gas prices. I always used to be so sensitive about it because it would rise up and down. But generally, electricity prices are incredibly stable, at least for in-home use. And you just don't even think about it anymore. As you say, we go on road trips and we, pay a little bit extra here. We pay a little bit less over here. But by and large, things are very stable as an EV owner. At least that's been my experience. And it just kind of falls. I remember as a nice driver, I would constantly be looking at the prices I was driving down the road to see. Someone mentioned, I think it was Crazy Postman, that his mom would drive a couple miles in order to save 3 cents on a gallon of gas. I used to be that person also.
And we can't really leave pricing because there's a whole piece of it that it is quite buried, right? I mean, we're kind of in this. We like to go into the PlugShare listing and find what the price is if it doesn't show it there, but it's available on Chargeway as part of the paid subscription, or you can dig into the provider's app. But these are much more visible things as you go down. This is why we know what gas prices are, apart from wanting to laugh a little bit and say, see what we were right all along. There's the piece of, you drive by it every day, you see that it's gone up from $3 here when I left Massachusetts to go to the UK, and then $3.40, $3.50 when I get back. So it's only a couple of weeks and it makes a big difference. But for EV charging, I can literally tell you where the place that has the gas-like sign at the ready location in what's that, Steamer's store in Illinois, is it, or Missouri?
Yeah, in what in Western Illinois.
So it's, there is one notable station, at least in the North American market, that has that facility of a big sign. It's much more common in Europe, and they do, a lot of the fueling providers, now that there are such levels of adoption over there, especially in the Nordics, will now have the price per kilowatt hour right next to the price per liter for liquid fuel. So I think that, that comes at some point. But it is a fair point that at the moment, you don't necessarily know what you're paying unless you're really doing the homework, and this is where it comes down to planning, right? What if you did just choose Pilot Flying J and you happen to accidentally stumble across the ones that were 79 cents a kilowatt hour and 65 cents a kilowatt hour? You're going to end that trip, and it's going to be a lot more expensive than if you'd just gone to IONNA, assuming that there were those options along the road. So definitely pricing, I can see Walter's point of, if you just want to get home, who cares what you're paying, right? You just plug in, get the juice, and be on your way. But when you have that little bit more leisure, and you may, be a little bit willing to flex on amenities, the price starts to come into the factor.
I will avoid the geopolitics as much as possible to keep this germane. But people overlook what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz is not just oil, it's natural gas as well. And I think a lot of Americans noticed their electricity bill go up in the last couple of years, but a lot of Americans did not make the connection that that was immediately following the Nord Stream pipeline. Well, most of the rest of the gas that Europe uses comes from the Middle East and goes through the Hormuz. So what's happening there is not just going to affect gas prices. We could easily see a doubling of electricity prices as well. So this is going to affect electric vehicle owners every bit as much as it affects gas owners, just maybe on delay. Because now we're looking at an entire energy market that's going to be affected. So, yeah, as they say, buckle up, buckaroos.
But it's 2 points really in that, isn't it? And a lot of people made that point in the comments there, so thanks for that. But the one is, we're insulated against it. If I'm going away to the UK for a fortnight and then come back 2 weeks later, my electricity prices haven't suddenly gone up, right? They've got to file the rate sheets, they've got to change all of that. And then it's generation agnostic, right? If you have no choice where you go and get your gasoline, really. I mean, you obviously can choose the different brands, but they're all the same. If you want a cheaper price, you've got to drive 200, 300 miles to a cheaper state, and that's completely defeating the point at that point. The electricity, I can pay a wide range here. If just in fast charging alone, I can go and pay. I can actually get it for free down at Boston Logan still, for some strange reason. I don't know why they're still doing that, but it's a station that is allowing free charging, and I can go to the place in New York where it was $1.20 a kilowatt hour, and they were fleecing people, who didn't look at the pricing. So, there's obviously those extremes, but in general, you're insulated against those kind of shocks for a while. And it's really a factor of, if that does happen, right, just like Europe experienced when the Ukraine crisis, shot energy prices through the roof, they definitely had to adjust, but they weaned themselves pretty quickly off of that Russian gas because, suddenly they needed to do that. So, yes, here in the Northeast, we're pretty dependent on gas, natural gas for electricity generation. But, equally, there are places in the central Massachusetts that are very nuclear. There's a lot of projects coming down from, Quebec and Ontario area with hydro. So it kind of, long-term planning wise, this is where the solar, the storage, all of the things that to tie it back to EVs, the people who are kind of bailing on EVs to an extent, Ford, some of the ones that are making a lot of batteries. In fact, I think, this is getting quite far off the track now, but the LG GM plant that was in Michigan, right, has now been Tesla committed to something like 4 point something billion for that factory for energy storage to get batteries. So, that is a through line in a lot of this, right? That the energy storage piece doesn't go away, and the fact it links it back to, this is why it's such a much more domestic security piece. There's so much more stability and predictability in electric vehicles and using electricity for our energy sources than the stuff that we're importing.
Well, and I made that note right in my trip as sort of as a commentary. Is at this point, I'm 100% charging my car at home on solar. So it's already done. I've already paid everything I'm going to pay. It's just from here until the sun stops shining, my car at home is going to be basically the cost is already accounted for. It's just amortized now moving forward. So it makes my trips much easier to account for, because now I get to say, oh, look, I spent $134.99 for a 1,000-mile trip. Well, I can say that with confidence because I know that the 200 miles of range that I started with was already paid for. But yeah, I think so. There's always that independence aspect that EVs bring to it that you aren't really going to get with any other option, because worst case scenario, you buy an inverter, a couple of batteries, and some solar panels, and lay it out, and you charge your car. So you have a lot more stability that way. So
It's definitely a sidebar there. Sorry. But there's a whole show probably in places where it's cheaper to charge your EV and why. I should point out the session fee piece for Ready. I haven't seen that here in Massachusetts. I think it sounds like the same in Michigan. So those are their two larger markets. That may be a factor of the site host there. I don't know, but I haven't seen a session fee for any of the Ready sessions I've done either.
Yeah, and I never really dived in enough to the Ready network to understand how their model works, whether they're the ones who set the prices, whether they defer to the site hosts. But then, that's that other aspect of it that I'd mentioned about my California travels. And one of the reasons why I'm primarily paying with card at this point is California is still the only state that requires point of sale payment options at chargers, and that could also be a factor for why Ready did that way, right? So that's the closest Ready site to me in California, and it's well over 200 miles away, so I don't really have an opportunity to use them that frequently. So I'm not sure if that's a consistent thing for Ready or if it's just maybe California specific. I don't know.
Yeah. And maybe site by site, but definitely in Massachusetts, we're usually around 50 cents per kilowatt hour with no session fee. They do have idle fees. I do recall one down in Longview, Texas, that was in a really remote area at the time, and that had something like 85 cents per kilowatt hour. And Ready actually commented saying it's a site where we break even. Basically, it's demand charges are huge there, and it just doesn't get the utilization to keep it up. So. From Dean, we have Ready session fees might be based on location, didn't get fees on the two local ones here. And Dennis, who is right there in their home state, says site host controls the price for Midwest Ready sites. So yeah, I think probably there are some site variations, kind of like the charge point stuff, right? If you find one that's dirt cheap, you're just as likely to find one that's through the roof price wise. I'm trying to see what we've missed here, because we took a side journey or a side quest into geopolitics briefly.
Yeah, and there is quite a few people chiming in about the national security aspect of electric vehicle ownership, and I can say I definitely hail from that viewpoint. I'm not overly socially conscious with my purchases, but if there is one thing that I can say that resonates with me for EV ownership is the uncoupling from foreign petroleum, at least doing my part in order to help accomplish that. And people are talking about electricity. Personally, in my particular case, I'm running on nuclear energy. We have a Duke Energy nuclear plant not too far from us. They actually got a permit in order to expand it to an additional reactor in the coming 3 decades, or however long it's going to take to build the thing.
Right, and there's a British Columbia, which is kind of, along with some parts of New York and Quebec, the gold standard for the mix of clean, sustainable, and cheap power. There's Canadian 36 cents everywhere all the time, no session fee for BC Hydro. Interesting as well because they just put up their rates, but their rates are so low that it, going up 10%, 15% really makes very little difference because it's just so reasonable in the first place. And that the other piece of that, I guess, is the utility-owned networks. They have started to. You have to go to the states where they exist, like your Florida Power and Light. For FPL Evolution, BC Hydro, Evolve New York with the New York Power Authority, but those tend to keep a pretty good handle on pricing. I think the most that Evolve New York goes to is 52 cents per kilowatt hour at the moment, and that's typically in the tri-state, presumably because of the cost of the property down there as well as the electricity. But in the north of the state, it's around 47 cents per kilowatt hour, kind of upstate, and in those areas where you go further close to Niagara. So there's some pretty reasonable and predictable rates at those state and province wide networks.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. FPL, I lived in Florida for a while, actually generates electricity from a little bit of nuclear, but primarily from gasoline-fired power plants, which is very volatile. And still they're able to keep them the rates relatively flat. So kind of an interesting approach they have out there.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, just from a pricing perspective, I know we've talked about this before, where we say maybe we've overemphasized the DC fast charging for travel, when a lot of the DC fast charging that we're going to need is really going to be to support people who don't have charging at home, and they're going to treat it more like a gas pump, right? Where they maybe fill up their EV once a week and they do their weekly commute. And those EV owners are going to be a lot more sensitive, I think, to the pricing, right? Than if I do a trip once every other week or whatever, what does it matter, right? I'm filling up cheap at home. Whereas if I live in an apartment and I have no other options, well, now if electricity rates at the public DC fast charging go up 20 cents a kilowatt hour, that's a huge impact to my weekly commute costs, even driving an EV.
That's worth. I always forget to mention this, but the first, it was 200 miles when I was talking about it in the Bolt and in our Ioniq 5, but more and more as ranges go up. First 300 miles, first 400 miles, first 500 miles if you're in that Lucid, although money maybe doesn't matter when you're in a Lucid at the moment. But those are all on home rates, right, for the most part. And then if you can charge it overnight, even better, in a hotel or something where there's maybe free or, cheaper, more affordable AC charging, that's, again, that level of mileage. It's a good chunk out of your road trip. So maybe not so much for folks who can't charge at home and the rideshare people that we've talked about, but when we're talking about road trips, the part of the length of that trip, Eric, your whatever the first stint you managed to do on that 1,000 miles, a good maybe 1/5 of it is done at solar rates or whatever you're paying for your home electricity. So again, that's another piece of saving, and maybe where you don't feel quite as gouged because that first part of the journey has been done on cheaper electricity. I think the only piece which we didn't cover was getting into kind of competitive distinctions. Now that there are so many providers, an IONNA, Mercedes-Benz Sidebar charging, we've talked about the individual sites and some of this, other than maybe the Pilot Flying J's and the Loves of the world, where they have that consistency that Eric mentioned, is a little bit down to site selection, and you have to kind of go site by site to decide. But as they develop, as IONNA goes from 100 to 1,000 sites and has the ability to kind of map out and say, right, some of our sites maybe don't have all the amenities that we want at these relays, but we want the majority of the network to be delivering this consistent experience. Maybe we can each pick out one or two examples where you think the network could, or the charging provider could, set itself out as this particular, this is what we stand on. This is where the driver pulls up and we know that we're going to get this particular quality, and that's why we would stop with them in this more competitive landscape of DC fast charging.
Well, I could start right now, and I think that's the Mercedes-Benz high-power charging network, right? And I've mentioned this before, where they're installing both NACS and CCS1, and I'll do this as a sort of a continuing thing now with the Alpitronics that actually show the different usage by plug, because then I'll have a direct side-by-side comparison. Because you'll know when you pull in whatever stall you pull into in the Mercedes-Benz high-power charging, your car is going to work with it because it's got both the NACS and the CCS1, and there's no adapter needed. And to me, that's a huge competitive advantage. Like, I think IONNA and BP Pulse, I think they both do this sort of separate units. Whereas I think Mercedes-Benz has a huge advantage by not needing an adapter, by being agnostic, right, if you will, for format. And I think Walmart is also going to be a huge differentiation in that, because they're taking each dispenser and saying, here's a CCS1, here's a NACS. This dispenser can serve either vehicle, no need for an adapter. That's a huge, huge competitive advantage. Sorry. You saw a stunned cat. All right, I'm off.
Walter, I'll let you go with your pick because I don't want to steal it.
There is a boxing term called rope-a-dope, and I personally think Walmart's getting ready to rope-a-dope the entire industry. They've got price. They've got membership discounts. They've got location, second to none. They've got quantity of stalls. They have state-of-the-art hardware. They have amenities galore. And soon, the sheer volume of sites is going to dwarf, as Eric has mentioned on one of his videos, even the Tesla Supercharger network, should they actually fulfill the promise that they had indicated. And by all accounts, they are following through. From Landon's good reporting, we're seeing vast amounts of activity occurring, and likely we only know a small portion of what is actually going on in their operations room of executing this plan. By all accounts, the plan is funded, and they don't wait 10 years to complete a plan. That's not what their culture is. When they have a plan and they are in the process of executing, they complete it as fast as humanly possible. And I think what we're going to see is a very quick assimilation of damn near monopoly status of the Walmart network, as I said, with price, location, and every amenity that you might possibly want, all available at your disposal. Close up into the garden center, which is my favorite entrance into the super centers.
Not mine, because you have to navigate all the mulch and the. It's like
Well, you get to walk by the barbecues, see if you need a new barbecue or not.
True, also true, but it's too cold to barbecue here for 3/4 of the year.
Never too cold to barbecue.
You didn't choose Pilot Flying J, which gives me at least half of my selection, just because of the 24/7 nature. I mean, I don't think anybody can offer that level, and obviously they aren't everywhere, and they're not going to be necessarily in metro areas, and they lend themselves to that travel convenience only in most cases. But I think, if I'm on the road after 8 p.m., that's going to be my first choice, regardless of price, unless it's really, really getting out of hand. And the other one was, someone mentioned, pull through, which I think the Rivian Adventure Network gets to kind of combine that with the adventure, kind of the outdoorsy national parks camping feel. It's not as prevalent across the network as they might make out, but definitely you're more likely to find a Rivian station at something like the outdoor stores or the grocery stores where there's healthy options that you might want. But they do have pull through at the vast majority as well. So that, combined with the fact that I just kind of like the UI and the way they operate. Pricing has been a bit of an issue with Rivian at some points, but as that seems to be coming down a little bit, and vast majority of the network is open now, I'd do a bit of a plug for Rivian at that point. I think we are at time. I think the last question I want to make sure we answer was from Dennis because it kind of hits back at will member pricing sway your travel plans? This has to be something that's coming in greater force. There are 8 OEMs behind IONNA, as we know, and they are one of them so far is offering 10%, which is, nice, but small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. Eric, you are a GM owner, as are both of us, but all of us. But in general, would that be something that will, when the discounts get to a point where they're meaningful, would that sway your decision on where to charge?
Honestly, not really. Like it wouldn't on its own do it, right? It has to be, like you said, a combination of those other factors, and I'll kind of close out with it because they're sort of still mostly regional to me. Like you shouted out Rivian, but also Pilot's 24/7 nature. I'll give another shout out to Electric Era because most of their sites are co-located at gas station convenience stops just off the freeway with 24/7 services. So that is kind of hard to pass up if all you're doing is traveling and it's a no fuss, no muss trip. Having I almost feel like the days of memberships are done because either you don't travel enough to need it, or it's going to be too confining and you're going to be too tethered to a specific charging provider who doesn't consistently offer you the services that you might want.
Walter, would they win you over with sufficient member pricing?
Yeah, I'm a sucker for novelty like that. And plus, it kind of extends there's two things. There's member pricing, and then there's owner discounts, which I think are different. But if we're talking owner discounts, what it conveys is a sense that I'm being taken care of. And I don't know, I kind of value being a customer that's not just going into a pragmatic engagement with the person that I'm purchasing a car from, but instead there's actually a bit of a acknowledgement that I'm a human being, and there's extension being given towards my well-being, and these little gifty things are kind of nonverbal communications to that effect. Like we all got the EVgo discount at the end of 2025. That was very thoughtful. I like that. And I wasn't the only one. I saw tons of people using it. The Pilot Flying J stations, I mean, if they're free 99, there's no reason not to use them. I saw tons of people using the Pilot Flying J stations with that free EVgo credit at the tail end of 2025. And things like that, to me, are well received.
Yeah, I'm still on not the highest plan for EVgo, but the middle plan. Probably should finish it unless I'm going on a road trip, but I stayed on that purely because I forgot to cancel after the credits and didn't have any kind of negative sentiment to EVgo, even though the their perks of their membership plan aren't extended to Pilot Flying J. The credits were, and I still consider them something of a seamless network to an extent because they all have auto charge. They all kind of carry the same equipment, so I know what I'm getting. So I'm pretty happy with that. I think it would need to be a decent amount. I'm probably looking at 20-25% at least to really plan a trip around member pricing. I think I understand kind of locking in Tesla Superchargers makes some sense to me for people who do that because they're so ubiquitous and you kind of know you'll find them everywhere. So if you're planning a trip wherever you go, more or less you'll be able to take advantage of those discounts. That's not necessarily the case with something like EVgo or whoever else has them. I'm forgetting now, but in any case, I think it would need to be substantial and ubiquitous for me to want to change my plans for that. And also because at the same time I like trying these different stations. I want to go to different places, so you'd have to really come up with some cheap offerings to lock me in. And with that, we are running up against our 90 minutes. There were some pleasant comments here, so I want to say thank you very much for Vlad. This program has become appointment viewing thanks to the hosts and insightful commenters. Absolutely, this is mainly the community. I find everybody comes up with great sidebars, great extra stuff for us, so we really appreciate you. And there was somebody else who I probably will miss here, so apologies if that's the case. Anyone who was nice to us, thank you very much. We will be back in 2 weeks' time. We may hit L2. We just passed 200,000 level 2 chargers in the US and Canada. Level 2 ports, a little bit more difficult to track than DC fast charging, but it's an important thing, and I think there's enough happening on the destination charging side. We want to hit it. But I should give some shout outs to my co-hosts. News Column, you can definitely go and check out the video that kind of inspired this one. It's 1,000 miles from North California down to the south and back in one day. It's perfectly safe. He took a nap. I saw it. And there's all kinds of charges in there. Lots of good stuff. So you're going to get your feel for the West Coast just by watching that video. Definitely go do that and subscribe to News Column. The Network Architect channel is where you will find Walter with weekly updates on DC fast charging and all these places we've been discussing here. That's why he knows which place to go and look at on PlugShare when you need an example. And also out of spec bits, lots of great content coming out there for DC fast charging updates and interviews with the players who are around there. I don't think I have a recent video on some reviews that I'm gonna do for products, but you can also catch me at evi.plugandplayev.com, weekly updates on the latest fast charging level 2. Also it's permitting, construction, and those kind of things. So if you want to know what's in the pipeline across multiple different providers, that's a good place to do it, and I'd appreciate your subscription there. Thank you for joining us. We are pretty much out of time, and we did a good one today, I think. So thanks for the topic, Eric. And until we see you in 2 weeks' time, cheers, nerds.